Hello, everyone. Welcome to D&I One-on-One. This is our bi-weekly webinar series. Today, I have the honor of being joined by Donny Shimamoto. But first, some introductions. So I am the host of the series. I'm Jina Etienne. I'm a CPA. I'm also a certified diversity executive. And in my work day to day, I work with clients developing D&I strategy, implementing those strategies, as well as putting together training programs, workshops and keynotes and conference sessions. So that is what I do for a living. And joining me is Donny Shimamoto. Donny is a non-traditional CPA. He's involved in business transformations. He's a managing director of IntrapriseTechKnowlegies and also the inspirational architect of the Center for Accounting Transformation. He's considered one of the top thought leaders and the top 100 influencers in public accounting. And I can attest to this by the pictures I've seen on Facebook. He's a foodie and a jet setter, speaks at conferences around the world and does not hesitate to post pictures of that food. Donny, thank you very much. You make me very hungry when you do that. So welcome.
Very happy to help facilitate that. I think we all need to enjoy food a lot more, and hopefully the company that you're enjoying it with as well.
Yeah. I remember when I became a vegetarian and I was looking at your pictures and I decided I got to stop. Anyway, thank you so much today for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is such an important topic, so I'm glad that we're able to tackle this.
For those who don't know, this session was inspired by a podcast. I was listening to Donny on a podcast with Celia Young, the Dear Accountant podcast series. And he mentioned how in his, as he's looking through this data that we're seeing constantly coming out, talking about diversity in the profession, that he wasn't seeing him represented in that. And I thought, okay, Donny, could you tell me more about that? And so can I start with a question to make sure that I'm understanding it? So materiality. If I'm looking at all of these reports, the AICPA trends report, we were talking about the CAQ report, the Cal CPA IMA study, we were just talking about that before we went live. The data is already there. I see chart, graphs, trends that show percentages by different groups. Is the materiality question a concern that maybe we're not putting the groups together in the right order? Some show small groups all the way down to point fractions of percentages. Others just show the main groups. When you think materiality, how does that show up in a graph or a report? What are you referring to?
So I think to answer that, we should take a step back and, materiality accountant, especially if we're coming from the audit side, we throw this word around. And often we think about it, well, it doesn't matter. And so we're looking generally at volume, right? And so we'll say that that's an immaterial amount. It's not going to affect the fairness of the presentation of the financial reports. But when you go outside of the financial data, and I do have an audit background and I come from the IT audit background. So most of our work is actually in controls. So the question, when we start to look at materiality in terms of controls, what we're often, or what the way that I teach it is, if someone knew that there was a this particular control deficiency, would it change their mind on whether they would rely upon a particular system or not? And that's materiality. And materiality in controls is really, and actually in the whole picture of materiality, what we're really looking at is, would it change someone's decision? Would a particular data point change someone's decision in whatever it is they're making their decision on, whether it's on whether to invest in a company, or in the case that we're talking about, how they approached a DE&I issue, or how they evaluate, like if it was a report on their own DE&I metrics, would it affect the way that they're looking at things? So first, I think we have to look at materiality and say, it's really about how does it affect decision making. Sorry, you're gonna jump in?
Oh no, yes. So sorry, yeah. So if we understand it, I mean, that makes complete sense. Most of us here are CPAs. Almost everybody on the attending today are from the accounting profession. But most of us would also say, if I look at a financial statement, if I look at other data that a CPA is preparing and providing to me, the materiality has already been factored in. I have the information. I can then make a decision from that. So how does that apply then if I'm looking at reports that show diversity trends in data and I have the information, it's right there?
Yeah, so in this one, it's actually the flip. So when we start to look at research reports, unlike financial statements, which are designed purposely for comparability, when we start to go through different research reports, and you mentioned the Cal CPA IMA study, we also had the report that I was referencing when I said I don't see myself in it. That was the Center for Audit Quality report, but even our own Center for Accounting Transformation is now working on a DE&I study as well. When you look at all of these things, they're not all presenting everything exactly the same.
Right.
And that's really part of the point here, is that when we start to go outside of this financial statement realm, we really need to look more at what information is being presented. And then actually the other thing that we really need to look at is the narrative that's describing the data. Because more often than not, all of us are looking at the data, but then we skim the narrative and we're expecting that the narrative is going to pull out the material points for, oh, this is the particular insight, or this is what the data said, or this is the conclusion that we're reaching and why. And particularly in some of these more academic reports, they also tell us the implication then. So this is the action that should be taken. And so the narrative, unlike the financial statements where, I don't know how many people actually read disclosures. I think most of us go, oh yeah, disclosures, whatever. The narrative in these types of research reports and again, these non-financial areas becomes even more important, and it pulls out and can affect what we perceive as material or not material.
So to continue down that vein then, and thinking specifically about the CAQ report that you're referring to, I see it two ways. One is the charts are there. The data then that they pull out and talk about is what is most prevalent in the chart, right? So the bigger groups are African American and Latino. And so those are the groups in the report. So if those are in the report, I'm reading the graphs and then I look at the narrative, and the narrative is now explaining those graphs. Are you saying then from a materiality perspective, because those of us reading the report won't notice the smaller groups that are absent in that narrative, and it is the absence of the narrative explaining that's where we run into some challenges. Did I say that right? Does that make sense the way I said it?
Yeah. That was coming back to the thought, the thing that struck you from my statement, which was I don't see myself in this report. And it came from the fact that I said, I don't see Asian Americans represented in this report. They were in all of the graphs and statistics that were shown, and we're not a small portion of the population by any means, especially when you look at Black, Latino, Asian American are usually the Asian Pacific Islander. They usually group us all together. So all of those all of those were shown within as well as white, were shown. Those were kind of the four major distinctions in that report. But when you actually read through the report, there was no mention of Asian or Pacific Islander anywhere else throughout the entire report. And all of the quotes that were taken, they were citing students and things that they had interviewed, were all Black or Latino. So when I read through, I was like, and it was funny because I read through the whole thing and I kept going, oh, this is good, okay, it makes sense, And then I got to the end and I was like, wait, that's the end. They never mentioned Asian. So I actually went back through with more of a fine-tooth comb and said, yeah, there's nothing Asian mentioned here anywhere. So it for me, and they actually presented that report at last year's AAA meeting. There was an entire session on it, and there was probably a good 30 of us that had attended that session. So there was myself and probably about 5 other Asians that were in the room. And it was very interesting because the first thing they said when they started that session was they said, well, we want to make a couple things very clear. And one of the things that they made clear was that we purposely focused only on Black and Latino because we only wanted to focus on underrepresented minorities. And so that is why we don't have any Asian citation within the report. And I was like, that's okay, I can kind of understand that, but that also didn't sit completely well because it effectively said we were immaterial to the DE&I conversation.
I'm going to go ahead, just realize the time. My bad, everyone. I'm going to push out that first polling question. We're just going to have the polls open for about a minute. They'll close by themselves. We're not going to share the results since they're just general attendance polls. So while that's open, sorry, go ahead, Donny.
Sorry, I was gonna, while that's open, I wanted to also ask people that, explain to people that part of the reason we do these types of polls, or I like to do these types of polls when I'm presenting, is I like to see who's in the audience and kind of understand where you're coming from as we go through these. So that's why these are very demographic type polls.
Yeah. So it's interesting what you were just saying. If that is the case, and they're leaning into African American and Hispanic populations in that report, should the report be presented? So I don't want to pick on the CAQ report. I want to use it as an example as we look at other reports, just to be fair. Should we then, for any of us doing research or sharing this, be very clear then, even in the titling and the introduction about the report, that we're looking at it specifically at this group for this reason? So that's one question. And then the flip of that is, I'm Black or I'm Latino and I'm reading this report. Should I notice the absence of other minority groups so that I can contextualize the experience that's being presented for me, or does that not matter so long as the narrative is appropriate for the group that it's specifically referring to, even if it's not mentioning any other group? Because a lot of this stuff is interrelated.
If there's a purposeful exclusion, in this case it was a purposeful exclusion, that's probably something that should be disclosed early on, right? That because we want to inform the reader, this is why we're not addressing this particular segment, and the woman presenting at the conference did exactly that. Now, the interesting thing that happened at the conference, though, was after I made my point and the panelists, because it was her and two others that were involved, kind of made their points about, well, this is why we're focusing on Black and Latino and we're not looking at AAPI. Actually, it was an older white gentleman, so I was kind of surprised, but older white gentleman kind of stood up and said, but isn't this whole thing about inclusion? And by not including this segment, are we truly, in the spirit of DE&I, are we truly being inclusive or not? And so that was an interesting thing, so that may not apply to everything, but when we're talking about DE&I, do we really want to purposely exclude particular segments? That I thought was a very interesting question.
I wrote that down because I have a couple of thoughts on that. Before we do that, you used AAPI. Can you share for everyone who's not familiar what that stands for?
Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So grouping in all of the East Asian, and remember that East Asian also includes what I think of as sort of Middle East Asian, the Indian, right? All of that area, the PI Pacific Islander. So you're Filipino all the way through Micronesian, Hawaiian. I'm from Hawaii, so I always think of that as Hawaii as well.
Thank you. I think a lot of people don't realize that those Middle Eastern countries are all grouped in there because they're not even included in the AAPI acronym itself, without, not that that was going there because of inclusion. But you said that his question was, are we being inclusive? And I think I sometimes struggle with this overuse of the word inclusion. Everything doesn't need to include everything. And I say this as a D&I practitioner. I think the context matters. And do we need to be inclusive of all groups? At some point, I feel like, shouldn't our data start to drill down into some of those nuances and complexities for the different groups? And it gets us back to your point then. Should that report specifically and clearly say, this is the group we're talking about? And almost, if that's the case, don't share information about the other groups. I mean, because when you share graphs, but the narrative doesn't match up visually to the graph that you're sharing, or even the captions, right? The captions and the call outs on the graph. That's where we can start to see some of that confusion. Maybe that's where the first moment of material or immaterial starts to show up in the visuals, and what I call attention to in those visuals.
Right, definitely. And actually, just a little earlier, I was on a presentation. I was attending a webinar on data visualization, and it was talking about what are the right type of visualization techniques and what should you show, right? And so it did point out the importance of making sure that what you're showing is representative and analogous to what you're describing as you're reporting on something. And it was about data visualization and storytelling, internal audit.
Right.
So still kind of very close, or definitely part of our profession, and calling out, again, kind of the same thing, where it's like, if you're trying to call attention to something, you need to ensure that you are properly showing it within the visualization, and then supporting it in the case that we're discussing, and ensuring that the narrative supports it correctly. But you raise, I think, a really interesting point, which is this challenge, and I even face this because I help put panels and things together, this challenge of often if we don't see everybody represented, all of a sudden we're seeing, or every aspect of diversity represented, all of a sudden we're seen as non-diverse or non-inclusive as we're doing things. And I've had challenges as well, pulling in, having one of every per se represented in every panel that we're doing. So I think the other thing sometimes we have to remember is that it's the effort towards inclusion doesn't always mean that the output is completely diverse. The effort of inclusion is part of the consideration of the panel, right? And who could be in there, and then ensuring that there are candidates that represent some of that diversity, but then in the end, making that decision on who moves into that final set may or may not be diverse.
I love the way you said that. I couldn't agree more. And I think that as we start to spend more time talking about diversity and spend more time focusing on when we say what inclusion means, it could create this expectation then that everything is always included. And so maybe there's something to the CAQ report, but for the fact that maybe there wasn't enough clarity either in the title. And I will say, when I went through and looked at those visuals, the visuals were simply what is it? It's like they printed the graphs without thinking about what the call outs should be around the graph. And is that what you're talking about with data visualization? If I never read the narrative and I only looked at the data being presented visually, should I be able to identify and understand then that we're leaning into the African American and Hispanic populations simply by looking at the visuals?
No,
is that
and actually,
what you were just referring to?
No, and it's actually the opposite, because in the graphs you see the full representation, but in the narratives we didn't see any representation.
Right.
So that's where perhaps a disclosure up front that says this report is purposely choosing to focus on these two aspects because we feel the CAQ feels that these are the two most underrepresented minorities within the population. That may help set the tone, some of the tone for that, because again, it wasn't just me. There was like five other Asians that actually showed up to that event to purposely say, like, we didn't feel like we were represented, and why.
Now, in our conversations, I want to say in the last call that we had, you brought up a really interesting point about over focusing on differences, which is sort of reminds me from just a moment ago, inclusion. I don't know if his monitor froze, so hopefully you're still there and you can still hear. Chris, do you see that? Or am I frozen?
No, you're not frozen. It looks like Donny's
frozen. Okay.
Donny, his screen is frozen, but he isn't. Well, I still see his audio on there.
Well,
Donny, can you hear us? He may need to call in. As a matter of fact, this may be a good time for a quick poll as well.
Okay, sure.
Okay, poll 2 is active. What type of organization do you work for? Make your choices now, and this poll is active for 60 seconds. And Donnie can try to log back in also if you'd like. You may want to get a message to me if necessary. Oh, I think he's back. Donnie, can you hear us? Oh, maybe not.
So I can see his mic is on. I'm not sure if his camera's there. Thankfully, we have this polling question that still has a ways to go, so hopefully he'll be able to pop back in.
When I close this polling question and toss it back to you, I'm gonna reach out to Donnie, see if we can get him back in here.
Okay.
Can you guys hear me okay now?
Oh,
yes, we can.
yeah.
Welcome back.
Okay, great. Sorry about
Welcome back. Perfect timing. We'll close this poll down, folks, in 3, 2, and 1, and back to Jina and Donnie.
Love it. So Donnie, you're on audio, not camera. Is that correct? I just want to know what I'm looking at.
I just double checked there.
Yeah.
There we go. Now we should be coming in.
Hello again. So what I wanted to ask you is sort of take us on a different direction, because the other day when we were talking, we talk about inclusion. We want to bring in everybody. And often we're looking for all of the things we have in common. Maybe we should be leaning into those differences. And your point, one of the areas to look at differences would be some of the similarities that these groups share. Can you talk a little bit more about what you were thinking there?
Sure. So this actually came from that same event as the CQ was there kind of defending their direction. You know, one of the things that their marketing company had discussed was, she said, well, you know, part of what we're doing is looking at these issues. For example, with the Latinx, they were looking at the issues of immigration and the fact that they're in these multi-generational households. They don't have a private place to work or study. And I sat there listening to that, and I was like, I don't know if you realize, but Asian immigrants, in fact, probably a lot of immigrants, have that same issue. So rather than saying this is a Latin immigrant issue, why don't we say this is an immigrant issue, which will cross all of the different ethnic types, and in presenting it as that, now we've broadened our ability to actually impact a greater population rather than just this one little segment here.
And so where that goes to, and that isn't it's not really what this webinar is about, but you know, these are conversations that kind of go all over the place. I'm thinking now about intersectionality, and we're hearing more about that. And I know we didn't talk about this in advance, so it's okay to say I need to think about this. But if we're going to be reporting this data and doing a better job of the narrative the way you're describing, at some point, how far is too far when we start saying, well, but this, but this, but that, and then when you do this, you know, at some point it feels the other extreme of inclusive, that we're trying to cover everything and therefore nothing is getting the attention it needs. Does that make sense?
It does, but the concept that I'm looking at is more the opposite. How can I design something that's going to get me the most impact to focusing on something that's so small? Right. And if you think about it, again, I'm going to use the audit analogy on it. In audit, when we're designing internal controls, right, or we're looking at the design of internal controls, the best internal control actually addresses multiple risk areas, right, or multiple assertions. And we want to do the same thing here in the DEI space. I can focus intervention or a program on a very small segment, but if instead I can design that program to address a bigger segment, but still keep it where it's meaningful and it's focused on these whatever you say objectives, 3 objectives that we're trying to hit, so that I'm not diluting it to get it to the point where if I do something that's so general it doesn't hit anybody, right? If I can instead design it very specifically, like I said, the immigrant experience, which is going to cross all of our Black, Latino, AAPI, and white, because there's white immigrants as well, right? If I can design something that does that and looks at these specific issues, multi-generational households, lack of access to a mentor of that ethnic origin, lack of access to normally financial means as well, if I design an intervention that actually addresses multiple things, rather than some of these things being immaterial to the conversation, even if they're not a focus, they now can be addressed by this particular situation. And as an example too, one of the things that the CAQ did, because at that session I had also said, you know, I went through your whole Accounting Plus site and I went through your social media, and there is no Asian there at all. There's Black and Latino, and in fact there was even a one or two white in there. And I said, if I came and looked at this, and if Accounting Plus is supposed to draw students into this, as a student, if I did this, I was like, oh, this is not for me. None of me is there.
Right.
What they've done now instead, they've actually interjected into some of the imagery, maybe an Asian in the background. Now, is the top of the blog or whatever they're doing Asian? But at least now when I look at it visually, I can, it's like, oh, maybe this is intended, because I can see, even if it's a smaller me, right?
Yeah.
In that imagery that's being used there.
So that's interesting. So I don't want to forget this. So I'm saying out loud curb cut, just so I don't forget. What's interesting about what you just said, though, is almost sounds like a contradiction. So I have this picture, I can start to see myself in the visuals, but if we don't address it in the narrative, that isn't the solution. And I think your overarching point is that it's important for the narrative to include all of the groups that are being represented and discussed, or be very clear that we're only talking about these groups through this lens, and then the narrative can continue because that context is important.
I think it's a little bit of apples and oranges, or maybe oranges and tangerines, because it's kind of the same thing, but not. So when we were talking earlier about ensuring the representation in the narrative, that was around the research reports. And because they're talking about the data that's being shown, and by not mentioning the AAPI within there and only doing Black and Latino, it's almost as if Asian is immaterial to this discussion, which it obviously is not. We're a significant portion of the population. So really kind of looking at that. Compared to in the CAQ's approach now, what we're seeing is an inclusion in the visual. Their decisions on what issues and what segments of the minority population they're targeting, for example, immigrants, is now not just Latino immigrants, it might be immigrants as a whole. So by removing actually the specificity around Latino immigrants, and perhaps in some of the language there, they can actually make their blog post or their recommendation more inclusive.
I follow you. So you were talking on that last part was really about some of their communication strategies, not their research. Got it.
Yeah.
So the reason I wrote down curb cut is that what you got me thinking about, I remember I wrote an article, gosh, I don't even remember when it was, about why if we think about a marginalized group, which reminds me, I actually want to come back to that as well. When you said that way at the beginning, when we think about a marginalized group, if we can identify a solution, it often will help more groups than the marginalized groups. So even if I'm not creating that intervention with multiple groups in mind, most of the solutions that you create for a marginalized group will often help the majority. And that's called, there's a concept called the curb cut approach that's referring to. So I would encourage folks look up curb cut, because we probably don't have time to talk about it here. If we do, we can come back to it. But that gets back to something that you were saying earlier. You want to talk a little bit about that? Because now I just thought I wrote down curb cut, but I didn't write down the other question. Do you remember what I was just saying, what I was pointing to? Wow, this is what happens when you get to be a
the marginalized,
thank you. Yes. Marginalization. So they talked about we only are referring to underrepresented groups. But if you say that, I'm thinking, isn't Asian an underrepresented group?
It still isn't. That's why I thought it was interesting, because it still is. Granted, the Asian population of accountants is actually higher, I believe now, than Black, the most, and that's only very recently, than Black and Latino, because Black was still leading the way for quite a while. More recently, we were seeing that, but there's also, for example, there was some data that was showing that even though there's a greater population of entry-level accountants, there was not still an equivalent representation of Asians at the executive levels within accounting firms as well. So, which to me, sometimes when I look at that, I go, well, that actually almost says that Asians are being discriminated against more than the others, because there's more of us coming into the entry level, but even less that are moving up into the executive levels and the partner levels, right?
I think this discussion, just illustrates how important it is for us when we're conducting research, that I think maybe it's being a little bit more specific in that research. I'm grateful for all of the data that's been collected, aggregated, evaluated to help illustrate and illuminate the lack of diversity in the profession in more concrete ways. But perhaps going forward, as if we've already covered that level, then if we start to dig a little bit deeper, we can be more intentional around focusing on different groups.
Yeah.
In one respect, but I think to your earlier point, also thinking across those groups about some of the other underlying challenges. And maybe if we do that, I don't want to hear people saying, oh, but we're not being inclusive because we're not including the groups. But what we're doing is getting to better understand some of the complexities and the nuances facing different groups, as well as minorities, even if they aren't more underrepresented than another. That makes sense?
Yes, yes. And I think one other thing to bring into that is that we have to remember this concept of underrepresented will also vary depending upon where we are.
Yes.
So like you and I were discussing earlier that with California, Asian actually is a majority in California. In Hawaii, Asian's a majority there. So it sort of flips it sometimes when you start to look at those types of things, because we're having differences. And in fact, there's some, what is it? I don't want to say it's anti-affirmative action, but there's some affirmative action type of things that are actually being reversed in California because there's too many Asians in some of the universe, or according to them, too many Asians in some of the schools there. So it's kind of interesting, and I think we have to take some of that lessons learned, because affirmative action has been in place for 20, 30 years now, and to look at some of the impacts and the way that we design programs and the way that what the outcome is. The other thing that I think might be interesting to introduce here is the concept of dominant versus non-dominant, because that's the words that the AAA is using in looking at this rather than minority. Because they're saying in any given place, there's a dominant and there's non-dominant. Because I've also spoken for some of the state societies. So for example, when I was in Oklahoma, talking about some diversity things, somebody raised their hand and they were like, I think I was in Oklahoma City, if I remember correctly. They were like, if you look at our population, we really don't have a lot minorities, period. And when I looked around the room, it was.
And that's not the only place. Yeah, I hear that a lot.
Yeah. So it's very relative there. So in there, we need to also look at other things besides racial diversity, right? And now you hear about neurodiversity, and the LGBT is definitely a big one that's been coming into the fore recently. Veteran, non-veteran status, like there's tons of different aspects of diversity. I know the other one that I think, especially when you're in a fairly non-diverse, non-ethnically diverse area, the other one to look at is income. Those of us that are coming from lower income, I came from a lower income family versus middle versus the very rich, who we all like to criticize, but looking at those, because those impact the way we might approach things.
So to play devil's advocate, dominant versus non-dominant, I completely get that, and I agree, and I think it's really important then when we talk about diversity and inclusion and we talk about minority groups, we're very clear to define the groups we're talking about. Otherwise, we'll all make assumptions. But some of the pushback that I get when I try to have that conversation, because even white men might be a minority in certain context, I think there's this attachment and I understand why, but there's an attachment to this idea that minority is a word we should be always using when we're talking about different groups, unless we start specifying, we're going to talk about neurodiversity, we're going to talk about socioeconomic difference, we're going to talk about disability, we're going to talk about some of these other groups, then the language can change. But if we're going to talk about racial and ethnic minorities, maybe we should always be using the word minority, majority. That language has an emotional connection. So that's me playing devil's advocate. What do you think about that?
And actually, that last point that you made might be one of the reasons to also not use that, because of the emotional attachment to it, which is going to cause, especially us as accountants, right? Emotionality is one of the things that plays into, I'm going to make a decision not based upon the data, but upon the way I feel about the data or the way I feel about a population. And minority, by invoking that, because I hear that a lot, it might actually be a detractor from that. You know, all the way until that end, I was agreeing with you, going, yeah, I can see minority being used for ethnic, because that's the way we use it for reference to ethnic. And maybe in these other areas, we can use dominant, non-dominant, because, you know, to give people some idea of the other dominant, non-dominant. So one very common one is going to be your straight versus LGBTQ. I grew up in I went through high school and college in the 90s. So back then, the percentage was 10% of the population is LGBT. Well, at that time, it was just LGBT. There wasn't QIA plus and all this other stuff that went on there. I read an article recently that says this latest generation, about 2% is actually identifying. So still not dominant, increasing, you know, non-dominant area, 1 in 5, 1 in 5. That's quite a significant change there. The other one that came up that was really interesting too, which I think is important, especially in the South, I think I see this a lot more, is the whole Christian versus non-Christian in the workplace. There was an organization that I was working with we were doing some strategic planning around the human people elements. And one of the younger white women actually spoke up, and she said, you know, I don't know if I should be bringing this up, but, you know, our organization has very strong Christian overtones. And I think someone that was LGBTQ or non-Christian would be very uncomfortable working here. And is there something that we can do to balance that out a little more so that someone can feel like someone from either of those populations, non-dominant populations, can feel like they still belong here?
Yeah. Oh, so many other places we could go with this conversation. And I'm looking at the time. I'm gonna ask us, Chris, let's do another polling question. I think something came in about that.
See, it's funny, you were worried we were going to fill the time.
Yeah, I was thinking, what are all the things you're going to talk about? And now I'm like, there are too many things to talk about them. So from what you were just talking about, I understand that looking at other dimensions, you know, I was just earlier this week at a conference talking about the fact that we need to understand that more diversity is invisible than it is visible. And recognizing that invisibility and that those dimensions matter. But some of those variations just now when you're talking about Christian versus non-Christian, or people that don't have a faith-based belief. And then you have right now, and this is where it starts to get almost as touchy as race. Depending on where you are in the country, there might be politics that can influence what people will or won't say, what people will or won't do in the workplace. And so at some point, there's just being thoughtful about what you're saying, dominant versus non-dominant. That context can really vary by state, by locality, by the demographics of the firm and the demographics of the clients. So now you just made it more complex. I'm sure that's what you were trying to do, right, Donnie? Just make it more complicated.
Well, it is and it isn't, right? And that's where we start to come back to the concept of materiality. So at what point have we made it so small and now it's we're at a level of immateriality to the bigger
Yeah.
picture, but yet we need to balance that, just like we did with the controls piece on like, how can I actually create an intervention or a program or whatever it is that's going to address the most number of things, elements,
Solve a
whatever it
specific
is.
problem with a broader benefit is what you're saying, right?
Right, right.
Because we
But
can't overlook the specific problem that we're trying to address. And so sometimes specificity does matter.
right, but I think converting that. So earlier we were talking about identifying. So let's say we were going Latin immigrant population. What are the things that are unique to them? Well, maybe it's also okay. Well, let's also look at other things other immigrant populations have. And so then if I, even within the Latin immigrant population, let's say there's 5 things, if there's these 2 things that are shared among all of the others, then these are the 2 we want to focus on more, because we're not only going to affect this one, but we're going to affect these others as well, which in our overall numbers is going to help us in the population as a whole.
That's a really great point. I absolutely agree with you. All right, so looking at time, and there are a bunch of things that have come in. I don't know if you've been watching the Q&A, because I haven't been keeping a close eye on it, and some of these might be more comments than questions. So I'm going to go ahead and take a chance, and folks, putting on my glasses so I can read this. The members, I'm going back to the order that they came in. So do members of the AAPI feel like they're grouped together with such a diverse group of minorities that their individual communities are overlooked, as in feel immaterial on an individual level? Great question, Brian.
Yes, that's an interesting question. I've actually had that conversation with several others of the Asian community. And so even the Asian community, there tends to be a thing like Japanese, Chinese, Korean tends to get grouped together because all of our countries tend to be, our countries. I'm actually a 4th generation American, so I consider myself American. But when you look at it, a lot of people go Japanese, Chinese, Korean. More well-off countries tend to be families, especially since a lot of our families immigrated earlier, like mine 4 generations ago. We already have acculturated into the American culture. We tend to be middle class, upper middle class at that point. And I want to contrast that of some of the others that are more immigrants, your Micronesians, your Hmong, right? There's going to be similarities in there. So yes, as we look at the AAPI, I think it's one of the challenges of addressing the AAPI community, that the AAPI community itself is also diverse.
Absolutely.
When we start to look at all other elements of diversity therein, and which is why I think it's more important that we focus on where are there commonalities across, not just within AAPI, but across the diversity spectrum, the ethnic as a whole.
That same thing applies for Latino. The Latino overarching, because there's Hispanic and then there's Latino, and they're not interchangeable terms. And how many countries are represented there? And then even with Black and African American, I get the question a lot, which is the right term? Because for one, it depends on who you talk to. But even for people who are, say, from the Caribbean and Black, they're not African American. Maybe they just go by, maybe they call themselves Caribbean American and take the race piece out altogether. So all of these, once you start to zoom in, can be a little bit more complicated. But I think that's what I was talking about earlier, about now we can start doing more nuanced research and going to some of the deeper levels on this to better understand overall. All right, so back to questions. Really like Donnie's perspective. I think this is a compliment, Donnie. Not only is the control design effective and efficient, it becomes impactful such that it rallies more stakeholders with resources to support its implementation because of the what's in it for me with them. The question is, how do we do that without becoming general?
And that's where I think that midpoint. And so this example again of the immigrant, I think, is a really good example, because we're not becoming general that it's all students. We're looking specifically at immigrant students, which can cross all of them and has some very specific, meaningful things like the multi-generational household, the language barrier. So I think this is again this judgment, and it's so important, right? It's one of our core things as accountants, this judgment of looking at it, and we may not be the one designing the DE&I programs, but we're the ones probably looking at it, looking at how much money they're asking to do stuff, and asking, are we getting the bang for our buck in the way that we're implementing this program? And that's that lens I think we have to look at is it too general? Is it too specific? Or is it this really good middle ground that's going to get us the most bang for our buck, maximize the impact?
I'm over here reminding us all that when you talk about D&I, it feels like a boil the ocean problem. I know folks might have heard me say that before. And I think to your point, if we as the accountants come in and do some analysis and do some of that assessment, quantitative and qualitative, and then you bring this data back to the client to start trying to figure out what's going to work, some solutions, even if it's a small group, there might need to be attention paid and resources put there, or otherwise you have a group that might never get addressed. The flip is what you're talking about, which is, can we step back and try to find some commonality between these different groups and see if we can craft a solution or an intervention or a program that can fill that gap. So I see it both ways.
And I'm not saying not to do the narrow. It just that you like you said, intentional. Either you're intentionally going for that narrow or you're going broader. And the example I'll give for that, especially coming from Hawaii, is in Hawaii, we see a lot of programs specifically looking at Native Hawaiian. And Native Hawaiian, very, very now, especially if we look at it in the grand scheme of the US as a whole, even within Hawaii, the Native population is the true pure Native Hawaiian population is declining, or not declining, but it's shrinking, and it's become more where it's spread. And so even the requirement around Native Hawaiian has been decreasing. I think it's down to like quarter. You only need to be a quarter now to qualify for some of these programs. But that's very specific, and it's intentionally very specific because they're trying to have that impact. And they recognize, though, that this is who we're trying to have that impact on. So it's not to say that everything has to be in this middle ground. If you're going to go specific, then go specific and be very, very specific then. But realize that if how is that actually going to impact whatever metric you're trying to impact? If you're looking at recruiting stats or overall minority mix or compensation mix, like what is that actually impacting? Is it going to have the impact that you're really desiring?
I would also layer into that or add to that, if you're going to be very specific, what is your overarching strategy? How might this tactic A affect tactic B and tactic C? And then how do these three things come together to move on to initiative number 2? And so taking all of that context, which is, D&I strategy, like any other business strategy, is longer term, and it's there are multiple steps and a lot of intertwining actions, and they're going to need to be revisited almost in an iterative way.
Yes.
And I think that's important because, and what I appreciate about today's conversation is when we bring it back to sort of the quantitative analysis, the objectivity, the applying procedures that we have in the profession to the work of D&I, it makes it feel more maybe approachable as a process rather than just a feel-good thing for minorities. All right, so let's see, are there any other questions? Really like Donnie's perspective. There's another thumbs up there. This is an observation about politics, particularly in Texas. I would like to think that the very definition of diversity, it's almost impossible to be 100% represented. That is an absolutely good point.
Absolutely.
And which is why I think we were saying earlier, we just need to be very clear about what groups we're talking about so that the conversation and the context can be better understood. And to your point, anybody who's writing an article, anybody who's pushing out a paper, just make sure that the narrative, it's clear who you're speaking about so that I don't then read this and assume we're talking about all minorities when in fact we're only talking about 2 groups. Or suggest by the absence of one group being included that that group is no longer important. And I think that was part of your overarching point and your thought, Donnie.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, that's
the challenge in a nutshell, right? All right. So I'm going to give you a moment to do your, last thought if you want to think of something. And before we do that, I'll just remind everyone that this is a biweekly series. The next session is now open for registration. James, I should double check, Danon, I think is how you say his name. I saw him speak at a conference recently on neurodiversity, and he really had some wonderful tools and strategies and helped to illuminate why, what are the complexities of neurodiversity and how can we do a better job of supporting those? It doesn't take a lot. It's just being thoughtful about some of those tools. And so I would invite folks to join us in 2 weeks for that session. As I mentioned, registration is open. And we should do that fourth polling question, Chris. We want to go ahead and open that polling question up. Thought it said the audio cut out. So can you hear me, Chris?
Yep, and I can hear you too.
I can hear you just fine. Stephen, what you may want to do is just refresh your browser if you're having an audio issue. And that poll is active, folks.
So Donnie, we have another minute or 3 left. Are there any final thoughts? There were a lot of things we talked about coming into this. I don't know that we covered all of those original thoughts. Anything else you want to add?
I think the last thing here, which we were kind of alluding towards all, and we really, I think, came to it just at the end, was I hope through a lot of this, we are helping accountants to better understand our role as we look at DE&I, and part of that is to help really look at what is material or not material. And it's definitely in a different sense than we would in the financial statements. And then the second major thing in there would be, our role in helping to look at how the money that's being spent in DE&I, how these interventions or programs are being designed, and really asking those questions around, is this having the right impact, or is this designed in the right way to maximize the impact that we can have through whatever program or initiative we're going to run on this?
That's an excellent point, and I really appreciate you joining me, because it turns out that inspired comment that you made really did open up the door to so much more of the complexity, and I'm glad we were able to bring that here. The one thing I want to share is, somebody asked it in the Q&A, so I'll just explain very quickly. That curb cut approach was something that started in Berkeley, California. We all have curb cuts. I'm looking at the window. We know them at the end of driveways. We see them all over the place, crosswalks. The idea of a curb cut was designed for a specific group, people with mobility challenges, and wanted to support them moving around in the city. And as it would turn out, all of us use curb cuts. And so they've become ubiquitous, and it's just one example of how something that's intended for one group can help many. We've heard that phrase, rising tides lifts all ships. Did I say that right? Is that the one that's right? So that's what that means. Donnie, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been amazing. I want to remind everybody that on Donnie's, let me go back to the slide here. So on the handout, if you download the handout, on his bio slide, all of his contact information is there. So I'm sure if you have follow-up questions, you can reach out to him. And my contact information is on this slide, so you can reach out to us. We will get the questions. If we missed your question, we'll be able to follow up, or you are able to follow up with us. So thank you. And Chris, I think back to you to wrap us up.